Latin America and the Caribbean has a population of over 600 million people. When you take Brazil and Mexico out of those numbers, those countries that happen to be also the largest by population and the most two developed countries in the region, you're still left with 300 million people. Every year, approximately 10% of those people make a shift somewhere along the poverty scale. Might not be a big shift monetarily, but it's a shift nonetheless. And when they make that shift, they have some more money. And the thing these people are buying is not a new iPhone, they're not buying a new flat screen TV, they're not buying a new car, they're buying protein. My story about the increased demand for protein and how it's affected my life starts in about 1976, and I'm not the character. There's a young man who lives in a city called San Fernando in Trinidad. He lives with his aunt and uncle, and he lives in the city because he's working as a bus mechanic for about 87 cents US an hour, the equivalent of that. His aunt and uncle have a few dozen chickens in the backyard, which is a common practice in Trinidad. And this young man is named Shahid. He goes to his uncle one day and he says, "You're farming your chickens wrong. You take the big ones out too early so that you can get some money. What you should be doing is you should be culling the flock, taking out the weak ones, and then the flock is going to prosper. And then when you sell the entire flock, you're going to ultimately end up with more money." Shahid's uncle turns to him and says, "You know, Shahid, if you know so much about farming the damn chickens, go buy your own." So he did. We fast forward about 20 years, 21 years, and I'm sitting in Trinidad. I'm a 26, 27-year-old man, and I'm sitting with this gentleman, and I'm talking to him about the problem he's having with some corn. He buys Canadian corn, he brings it into Trinidad, and he's wondering why, after storing it in this damp, dark, dank, cinder block warehouse for about 5 to 6 weeks, it suddenly gets very hot and butterflies fly out of his corn. That's not an ideal condition for when you're storing corn. This trip was pivotal in my story because not only did I establish a relationship with this man that has lasted almost 20 years, but it has also been my first exposure to globalization. What my idea is, and it's an idea that is actually being put into practice as we speak, and this is the roadmap, is that globalization has happened. It's something we're all familiar with. It's created some emerging economies. So in those emerging economies, there's been an increased demand for protein. That protein, some of it is animal protein, and it needs to eat, it needs food, and that has translated into a value-add solution that we have right here in Chatham-Kent. That says globalization on. Anyway, what is globalization? Globalization is just really the removal of barriers. Those barriers might be language barriers, those barriers might be access barriers, they may be trade barriers, they may be freight barriers, they may be technical barriers. Really, that's all globalization is. That's nothing new. We all know what that is. I'm going to tell you what life was like, what my life was like before globalization by using an example and a story. I was working as a young engineer here in Chatham-Kent, and one of our customers, who was in the tiny island nation of St. Vincent, which, just to give you some context, would physically fit, the island of St. Vincent would physically fit inside Chatham-Kent over 6 times by land area. It would fit about 1.25 times by population. That's the entire country. And 20 years ago, they had a motor on one of their pieces of equipment that went bad, and they needed to get a replacement motor. This is before the internet. This is before cell phone technology. Their phone system didn't work very well. We were their only point of contact to the outside world to get a motor. So they called us, said, "I need a new motor." So I then, in turn, hung up the phone and called our motor shop, which also happened to be here in Chatham. The motor shop called their manufacturer and ordered a new motor. That motor was made in a factory in Brazil. The motor was put on an airplane, and I would bet big money flew directly over top of the island nation of St. Vincent to land in the airport in Toronto. The motor was then taken from Toronto, put on a truck, driven down the 401 to the motor shop that we deal with here in Chatham. From there, it was put on another truck and brought over to our shop. And from there, we took off all the labels, put on our own labels, and guess what we did? We put it on a truck, sent it up the 401, put it in an airplane, and it went to Miami, and eventually made its way. You don't have to be a logistics expert or an MBA to know that that's not a very efficient or effective process. And that doesn't exist anymore. And that little story exemplifies what has happened with globalization. Early in my career, I had a three-part epiphany when it came to globalization. And it didn't happen immediately. It happened over the span of years, and I didn't even know it was happening. But looking back, it's pivotal and crucial to this story. The first part was when I was working in Trinidad, and I got to know some of the people that I was working with. And I had the realization, I remember it was a very sinking feeling. I had the realization that these people are extremely capable people. They're very willing to work, and they're also motivated. Their motivation for work wasn't like an iPhone or a TV or a new car. Their motivation was food and shelter and a nominal improvement on their life. That was a bit of a sinking feeling for me. The second part of the epiphany was a few years later when I'm sitting having dinner with one of my clients in St. Vincent, and part of their business is as a rice processor. We're sitting there, we're having dinner, and we're just talking about life. These guys are complaining because their sister company is taking away some of their rice production. And the biggest reason they were able to do that is in Guyana, where the sister company was, they were able to pay their employees 30 cents an hour. These guys were complaining because they had to pay their employees $3 an hour. You can imagine, I didn't say anything, but you can imagine what I was thinking when I'm thinking about the guys that we're paying upwards of $30 an hour. It didn't seem to bode well for anything that we were doing back in Chatham-Kent. The third part of this epiphany that I had was I was sitting in a luncheon in the state of Minnesota, and the governor at the time was a guy named Tim Pawlenty. No, not Jesse the Body Ventura. It was the guy after him. And Mr. Pawlenty was talking about manufacturing in his state of Minnesota and the effect that globalization was having on it. He was talking about these barriers that we're lifting and everything. But the most critical thing that he said that I took away from that day, and I didn't even know I was taking it away, but looking back, is he said, good or bad, right or wrong, we cannot pay people $26 an hour to put nuts and bolts on things like truck and car frames when someone anywhere else in the world will do it for less than $5. That was a scary time. And for me, as a young engineer looking forward to a career in southwestern Ontario, the thought of globalization and what was happening really scared me. But I have this life motto that within every perceived problem, there lies an opportunity. And what I'm talking about today is in the perceived problem of globalization, there are many opportunities for communities like Chatham-Kent to become globalization's beneficiary. When we talk about globalization has created some emerging economies, and we can see that when we start to look at things like poverty rate. On this graph, the orange line and the green line, they represent the percentage of the population that is in extreme poverty and in poverty respectively. The blue line represents the percentage of the population that's in middle class. We could sit and we could talk about the lines on this graph, but what it really means is that from the year 2000 to the year 2014, about 150 million people have shifted somewhere along the poverty line. These people aren't getting rich, but they are less poor. What this graph shows is there happens to be one other thing that people do when times are good that doesn't involve spending money, but it does mean that the population goes up. You can see that line there. That line shows a steady increase. And I could sit and talk about the slope and the numbers on that line as well. But what you need to know and take away from that line, to put it into perspective, is that every 5 seconds, one net new person joins the population of Latin America and the Caribbean. To put that into a bit of context for you, is during my supposed 18-minute TED Talk, 200 more people have come on the scene in that region. To put it into further context for you, is in the 24-hour period from midnight last night to midnight tonight, the population has increased in a way that we could fill 15 Chatham-Kent secondary schools. I want you to think about that for a second. Today, the population that's been added to Latin America and the Caribbean could fill 15 of one of the largest high schools in the city. That happened today, that happening tomorrow, that's going to happen every day. If you happen to know somebody that has some expertise in building schools, you might want to direct them to this talk sometime in the future. The last thing about emerging economies is an indicator of an emerging economy is life expectancy. And what that shows you is that from about 1960 to 2014, the life expectancy in Latin America and the Caribbean has gone from 56 years old up to 74. So what does all that mean? When you do the math and you think that there are more people, they're living longer, and one thing that we all either like or want to do every day is eat, and they have more money, when you do all that math, it shows a potential increase in the demand for protein of over 300%. That orange line there is the chicken consumption in Latin America and the Caribbean from 1965 to 2013. The index there shows you it has increased 16 times. Animal protein, it needs to eat. And the main dietary, parts of its diet are maize, or what we know as corn, and soya. As well, sometimes humans choose not to eat their protein in the form of animals, and they get it in another form in wheat that's converted into flour and then baked into bread or whatever. A lot of these countries in this region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, with the exception of maybe Brazil and Argentina and parts of Colombia, they need to import the majority of their grain. And the way that happens is it arrives on ships. When it arrives on the ships, it then gets put into storage for a little while. After it's in storage, it eventually gets distributed out throughout the country to the different processors, who then in turn process it into animal or human feed. And that's where we come in. Before we talk about what we're doing with value-add manufacturing in Chatham-Kent, we have to put it into context. And one of the things we have to realize is that manufacturing in southwestern Ontario and other areas around southwestern Ontario has changed forever. It's not gone, and mass manufacturing isn't gone, but it is substantially reduced, and it's not likely coming back. And the example I like to use, as I like analogies, is when I was a kid growing up, the big scary thing was made in Taiwan or made in Japan, and everything was made there. The garden tools, things like the toaster oven. And today, automotive manufacturing is like the toaster oven of the 70s. And a lot of our economy is driven by automotive manufacturing. What that means is that places like southwestern Ontario, we need to shift our focus. And we need to shift our focus on things that are where we can be more competitive with our competitive points of differences. We still want to take advantage of those barriers that still remain in place in spite of the fact that globalization has happened. Some of these competitive points of differences are things like technical expertise and a skilled workforce. Those are fairly self-explanatory. Another thing is we have infrastructure here that is business friendly. We have highways, we have airports, we have hospitals. Another thing that you may not think of right off the bat is that we have access to capital and we have a secure banking system. This is a competitive point of difference. It's hard to imagine, but outside of Canada, that and maybe parts of the United States, that is a rare thing. And it's something that we have that other people don't. Another thing that you may not think of right off the bat is what I call institutional or regional knowledge. And in an area like Chatham-Kent, we have been moving grain around and processing it for decades. And that is something we have that we can export outside here. Another competitive point of difference that I like to think that we have is the Canadian brand. And it still means a lot. And it means a lot when I'm traveling around the place, around places and doing work. And what we have done is we've bundled up these competitive points of differences, and then we're able to access that increased demand for protein that has been created by emerging economies, which were created by globalization. And the way we're specifically doing that is we take raw steel. We take quite a bit of raw steel, and we cut it, we bend it, we weld it, we coat it. Then we take those steel parts and we assemble it together with things like some polymer parts and some motors and gearboxes and chain and drives and actuators and nuts and bolts. And then we take that and then we ship it somewhere else. And the people we're using to do that, we've got people doing that that are skilled and are very good at things like engineering and design. figuring out how we're going to build that and how we're going to put it together. We have people that are very good at welding and bending metal, and they're experts, and they're able to help us do that. We also have people that are working on ensuring we're purchasing the components we need for the parts so that we're able to remain competitive. We have other people that are ensuring that we have our financing in place so that we can fund this kind of work. Yet again, we have some more people that focus on health and safety. And what they do is they help us ensure that the guys that are working for us, guys and girls that are working for us today, are going to get up tomorrow and come back and work for us again without being hurt or injured. And the most interesting thing, or the most important thing of that, is all of these people are citizens of Chatham-Kent. They're local people. And that is important. And why that is important? Imagine, if you will, we take something and geez, that didn't come out very good either. We take something and we sell it to somewhere in a place like Guatemala for $100. When we bring that $100 back into Chatham-Kent, about 30 of it goes into miscellaneous government fees and taxes. Nobody likes to pay taxes, me included. Shocking, I know. But if you do this long enough, you realize that those taxes pay for that infrastructure that is absolutely required in order for us to do our business. More importantly, though, there's 53 of those dollars that come in and get injected right into our local economy. That gets injected through employee wages, gets injected through some of the operation expenses that we get serviced locally, like the guy that fixes our computers and their utilities. And the best thing about that is that this $100 that comes in and gets injected, 53 of it gets injected into our local economy, is that it's fresh money. It's not money that's being recycled through our economy. It's fresh. It's new money to our area. And that is exactly how we are taking a Chatham-Kent value-add solution, and we're servicing an increased demand for protein that's being created in emerging economies that are a result of globalization. I'm going to leave you with two things. One, I want you to think for a second to imagine the boon it would be for communities like Chatham-Kent if all of us could figure out what it is that we have that's a value add that we can export to another part of the world. And the last thing I want to do is I want to conclude the story of young Shahid that was living in San Fernando in 1976. Today, he has a vertically integrated chicken company, and he processes about 40,000 chickens.